Different callings throughout the Bible where God is called. And we're going to look at one that probably many of us, is probably more of a children's story, if you will. But we're going to look at Samuel's call. And we're going to look at Samuel chapter 3, 1 Samuel chapter 3. I better be specific there. 1 Samuel chapter 3. And there's a story of President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, who got tired of smiling the big smile and saying the usual things at all those White House receptions. So one evening he decided to find out whether anybody was paying attention to what he was saying. As each person came up to him with extended hand, he flashed a big smile and said, "I murdered my grandmother this morning." People would automatically respond with comments such as, "How lovely." Nobody listened to what he was saying except one foreign diplomat when the president said, "I murdered my grandmother this morning." The diplomat leaned in and responded softly, "I'm sure she had it coming to her." The problem today is not that God is not speaking, but rather we are not listening to Him. And it's not the Lord who is not speaking, but it's us who is not hearing. And I use this illustration because we see this as a lead up to Samuel's call. And we'll see that. In fact, we'll just go ahead and start reading of Samuel chapter 3. We're going to read the whole chapter. Don't worry, it's only 21 verses. It's not that long. But starting with the first verse of 1 Samuel chapter 3, the boy Samuel served the Lord in Eli's presence. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and prophetic visions were not widespread. One day Eli, whose eyesight was failing, was lying in his room. Before the lamp of God had gone out, Samuel was lying down in the tabernacle of the Lord where the ark of God was located. Then the Lord called to Samuel, and he said, "Here I am." He ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "I didn't call," Eli replied. "Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Once again the Lord called, "Samuel." Samuel got up, went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "I didn't call, my son," he replied. "Go back and lie down." Now Samuel had not yet experienced the Lord because the word of the Lord had not been revealed to him. Once again, for the third time, the Lord called Samuel. He got up, went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli understood that the Lord was calling the boy. He told Samuel, "Go and lie down. If he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came, stood there, and called as before, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel responded, "Speak, for your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "I'm about to do something in Israel that everyone who hears about it will shudder. On that day I will carry out against Eli everything I said about his family from beginning to end. I told him that I'm going to judge his family forever because of the iniquity he knows about. His sons are defiling the sanctuary, and he has not stopped them. Therefore I have sworn to Eli's family, the iniquity of Eli's family will never be wiped out by either sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until the morning. Then he opened the doors of the Lord's house. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son?" "Here I am," answered Samuel. "What was the message he gave you?" Eli asked. "Don't hide it from me. May God punish you and do so severely if you hide anything from me that he told you." So Samuel told him everything and did not hide anything from him. Eli responded, "He is the Lord. He will do what he thinks is good." Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and he fulfilled everything Samuel prophesied. All Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a confirmed prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear in Shiloh because there he revealed himself to Samuel by his word. So quite a story there, quite a calling. And again, as we talked about, as I referred to President Roosevelt, that before this, leading up to it, and we see that in the first verse specifically, and kind of setting the scene here, if you will, of what is going on, we see that the word of the Lord was rare. If you read before that, we see why. And of course, through the prophet or the prophecy that was given, the vision and what he was told, and Eli was told even previously, we see that it was because they were ignoring God. They weren't listening to God. His sons were not listening to God. And Eli was allowing it to happen. And in fact, they were doing the exact opposite. They were making it difficult for the people to come and serve and worship the Lord, to offer sacrifices. They were taking advantage of people. They were doing the exact opposite instead of listening. Listening to God's call. Listening to His Word. And again, it's safe to say that that doesn't mean God was not speaking, because we know that He was. They weren't listening. And again, the word of the Lord was rare. And we know later one of the prophets, the minor prophets, Amos chapter 8, verses 11, Amos talks about again also this, not referring to 1 Samuel, because obviously Amos was much later. But he says, "Hear this, the days are coming." This is the declaration of God, of the Lord God. "When I will send a famine through the land, not a famine of bread or a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord." A famine of not hearing the word of the Lord. Amos talked about it. And we know that even leading up before Jesus, we know that there was also a time of quiet where they weren't hearing from the Lord. And we kind of think of it from Malachi to where Matthew starts if we look at the Bible. But we know that, yes, Malachi was probably the last word written or spoken from God, who was listening until the birth of Jesus, or leading up to the birth of Jesus. The word of the Lord was rare. And it makes me think and question even, are we in another time of silence, or rather a time of not listening? Are we in that today? I think we are. We are in a time where we don't listen. God is speaking, because at different times we hear it. We hear Him. But do we listen? Or do we ignore it? And so that leads us up to this call that Samuel was given. And we're three things here: the call and the message and the result. And I want to look at the call first, because this is where a person must listen. When God calls. Now, of course, if you want to, if it helps, you think of the phone, God calling and talking to you. That's our main communication now. We seem to do less and less face-to-face and more and more on the phone. But do we listen? And again, this is where each person must listen. And we know here Samuel was young. He was a boy. And probably not as what the Jews would understand an age of accountability. He probably was just turned 13 maybe. We have a nephew that just turned 13. And we think about that, and maybe hopefully all of you can think about that. When you went from 12 to 13, it seemed like that was a stepping stone, if you will, from being a kid to being a teenager. With the Jews, it was an age of accountability, an age where they progressed and they actually became more in-depth in learning the Word and studying the Word and knowing God. He was of this age, but yet had not been able to yet study. He was just helping in the tabernacle, helping Eli. And we see that Eli needed help because he was getting old, his eyesight was going away. And we know that this whole event happened in the middle of the night because the lamp of God that was supposed to be maintained was going out. So we know it was early morning before anybody got up. I also think that because of that, that might have made him a better listener. learning something new, something he hadn't heard before. And I'm sure that calling that he heard 3 times probably made him sit up in bed. And of course, that probably concern for Eli. Thought he was being called. Thought that Eli was calling him instead of God. And went to him. And again, that brings us to another question. Do we mistake God's call? Do we get confused with all the messages that bombard us today? And we have several. If you think about it, and I thought about this last night, and I didn't really do a quick survey, but how many things, Facebook, how many things do you look at or see in just probably 30 seconds? Take that with probably how long do we sit there on it? We are bombarded with things. Then you add in the TV, the radio, the people maybe that we talk to. We are bombarded with messages. We know the advertisers, that is their main thing, is to bombard you with a message that, I remember learning about that, I don't know where, in high school or whatever, that they want to repeat a certain phrase or a certain thing so many times because they know that then the person will remember it. And so you hear that same thing, whether it's the product or whatever it is, repeated over and over and over again. We are bombarded with messages today. And so we have to determine and discern whether it is the world that is talking or whether it is God calling. If it's the world talking, it's just static. And so we must remove those things that distract us. Now, Samuel had, I think, a blessing of actually living there at the tabernacle. Probably was more isolated. He was being brought up to be in that as a priest, a minister of God. And so maybe he had less distractions. But also he was innocent. He hadn't gone the way that Eli's sons had. And as a result, Eli had allowed them to. So he was more receptive to God's call. Hebrews 12:1 tells us that we must lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us, and I think too distracts us. So we have to lay aside those things, remove those things that distract us so we can hear. And we know that also as God continued to call Samuel, and it also shows that God continues to call us even though we may not answer the first time. He doesn't give up on us. He didn't give up on Samuel. He didn't just go to find somebody else because he understood that, for one thing, Samuel didn't understand fully what was going on. But then that 4th time, and I think it is important to read that in verse 10, the Lord came, stood there, and called as before, Samuel, Samuel. God came and stood there in front of Samuel and called his name twice. And we looked back at it and we talked about another time where that happened, that with Moses when he was at the burning bush. God called him twice. And I said that that was in the Jewish custom culture, they understood that meant that you better listen. Called your name twice to get your attention. Now you better listen. God said his name twice. But I think, too, the Lord came and stood there. I tend to think that was probably Jesus coming and standing there. And talking to him. And Samuel responded. And we must do that. We must respond to his call, whatever that may be. And he said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." You may want to highlight that or underline it and commit it to memory. It shouldn't be hard. Speak, for your servant is listening. But can we do that? And do we mean it? So then we have the call, then we have the message that was given. And God gave a message to Samuel, a difficult message for a boy. I can't imagine being told this, what was going to happen, even though Eli had already been told once. But again, I think too, it was given a second time to confirm it. God was confirming He meant what He said. And He spoke through this boy, this innocent boy, this young boy. This is what you are to say. This is what is going to happen. And again, we may be given a message when we answer the call that is difficult. And it may be even a drastic change that you are going to have to make, or you may have to tell somebody to make. Samuel had to do that. And we see that this was also a pivotal time. A drastic change was made because there was going from mainly the priest to now God was going to speak through prophets. And we see this beginning because we know Samuel, as we read later in the two books of Samuel, how he anointed King Saul and then anointed King David. It was all done through the prophets. And we know before that it was the judges. God worked through them. And again, there are several callings you can look at there, and there were so many, it was hard to choose exactly. So that's why I kind of went over them and went to Samuel, because each one of those judges was called for a specific purpose. And again, we are all called that way, but we are called for a specific purpose and also to give a specific message, whether it is to one person or a group of people. And again, the message may be difficult, and sometimes we don't want to answer because we're afraid that we're going to have to give a difficult message. It is difficult even for me sometimes to stand up here and give some of the messages that I feel the Lord putting upon my heart to give, because I know it talks about hell. It talks about sin and going and what the end place is going to be. But again, I have to be obedient. Each of us must be obedient to give those difficult messages. And it is not because we want to condemn and we want to just, do the old Bible-beating thing, but because we love them. And we don't want any to perish, because Jesus doesn't want anyone to perish. God doesn't want anyone to perish. And sometimes He knows that we have to speak. He speaks through us to the people. And sometimes, yes, it is difficult. And we know that some of the prophets, we studied Jeremiah, and we know that he was locked up, he was thrown in a well, he sunk in mud, he had to be pulled out by ropes, and I'm sure he probably had some sores from that because of the message the Lord had given him to give. A difficult message. And sometimes that is the difficult message, again, is why we may not answer. We might let it go to voicemail. But we also see in this story where the person, if they listen to God, the people must also listen to the person sent by God. And we see that here shown in verse 18 where, of course, Eli asked him, what's the message? Give it to me. Don't, basically, probably in my terms, I'm not going to be mad. He probably had an idea maybe what it was going to be about. But yet he also told the boy, give it to me, tell me the truth. And he said that there would be consequences if he didn't. And yes, when we are called to give this message, we should give it truthfully. And yes, sometimes the truth hurts for a bit. But if the people respond, then there will be great rejoicing. But we see here where Eli responded that yes, he is the Lord. He will do what he thinks is good. He submitted to God despite what was going to happen. The message must be given. And yes, hopefully the people, whether a person or the people, are receptive to that message and respond to it. And then we also, after we answer the call and give the message, then we know we will see results. Because we listen and respond, we will see results. And we see that with Samuel. The results were given. We know that what happened, what God said would happen, did happen. You read that not too many chapters later, when the Ark of the Covenant was taken. And quite the end for Eli, if you will. Just basically falling over and breaking his neck. But we see where that where it came true. And we see the results of that as people understood, became to know who Samuel was, and that he was this prophet. And we know that they probably referred back, this is what Samuel was told, this is what happened. And so we see here in this chapter at the end, in verses 19 and 20, where Samuel grew and the Lord was with him, and he fulfilled everything Samuel prophesied. All Israel confirmed that he was the prophet of the Lord. And we can see that throughout his life here in 1 and 2 Samuel, where it all came true, it all happened. Everything that God told him, he was obedient. He answered the call each time God called him to give a message. Each time God called him to anoint the king, a king. He responded. And then he also gave a message then, because he told him what was going to happen. He's like, you don't want a king. This is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen to you. And of course we know that as you read, you see that happen to the people. God fulfilled his own word that was given through the prophet Samuel. And when God gives us a word, and when we call and we give the message, answer the call and give the message, he will work through us. He will send a message through us, and he will touch and speak to people through us. God used Samuel for great things, and God will use us for great things as well. But the key is we have to listen and respond when God calls. Listen and respond. It's a vital part of relationship with God. And we must be ready to do that when he calls upon us. And that may be he may be calling upon you to minister to somebody, to talk to somebody, to pray with somebody. He may be calling you to come and ask for forgiveness. Ask him into your heart. To recommit, to say, yes, I will not let it go to voicemail anymore. I will listen, I will answer, and I will respond when I hear him calling. And I hope you will do that every day. Not just on Sunday, but every day. Let us stand together. We're going to close with singing the hymn, I'll Go Where You Want Me to Go. It'll be in your hymnal, hymn 354, if you have one nearby. You may have to scoot over and share with somebody. It's okay. We're all family. But again, in this hymn, I'll go where you want me to go. Hymn 354. And we must answer. And sometimes where he wants us to go may not be where we want to go. But we must listen and respond and be obedient. So let us sing together. And if you have a need, I would love to pray with you for that need. bless you and keep you, and the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. You are dismissed.